Okay, so intake manifold removal. We'll start with the alternator duct. There's this clip, usually breaks when you pull it out. This guy comes up, rotates out. Then this clip comes up. These are normally two clips that are 90-degree rotate clips, and then that guy comes out. Next is the air box. A lot easier to do with a ratcheting wrench. There's one bolt on, or nut on the side. It's the wrong direction. And you don't need to take them off, you just need to get them loose. The second one is on the back, down there. It may be easier to view from where my head is.
Yeah.
Right there. Again, you don't need to get these guys off, you just need to get them loose. And then disconnect the map. Undo this hose clamp. And then there's one more thing that people normally forget about, which is the aux heater thermostat, which has a 10mm bolt. I'll move my hand after I get this socket on it. There's the... This guy will be a lot easier to see where it goes once this component comes out. But it's a little bit buried in here. It's kind of a bit of a pain to reach into if you don't have small hands. Come on. Alright, so here's thermostat. I like to put bolts back into where they came out of. Now, the air box will come right out. It comes up a little bit forward to push it off the boot, and up and out. The thermostat goes into that spot right there. Watch the hose clamp doesn't get lost. Next is this intake boot. If you have ASC, there's a secondary throttle plate right here, and some of the little hoses that connect in underneath will look slightly different. This hose is coming from the crankcase breather, this guy right here. M50s don't have any sort of valve in there, it's just a straight pipe. And this hose is going in a loop underneath the intake to the idle air control valve that we'll see shortly. One thing to check on while you're under here is look down at this power steering hose. If you can slide it back and forth like this, it's a good excuse to change the hose because it's probably a power steering fluid leak. There's the throttle position sensor to remove and work out of the way. And actually, that may be the only thing we have to take off, because we're not actually going to remove the throttle plate from the car. We're just going to pop it off the intake, because our goal is just to get the intake off. Side note, you're supposed to lubricate these throttle cables every time you do an oil service, but nobody ever does that for, probably because they don't know. These bolts will of course look different if you have that secondary throttle plate I mentioned earlier. There'll be a bracket on top of this, but the 4 bolts are still the same 4 bolts. They are just longer and have a bracket on them. Alright. That's been replaced because it's got a BMW parts sticker on it. Alright. There is our throttle plate. It actually looks reasonably clean. Next is, I think I'm probably going to take off this boot just to give me better access under there. Oh, it's not tight. Great. So actual stuff holding the intake manifold in is, there's two braces on the bottom side here. You can see the very top of them there and there with a bolt that goes from the bottom up into each of them, and then there's the like 7 or 8 bolts that bolt the intake to the head. That's all that physically holds the intake manifold itself in the car. Most of the scariness of removing the intake manifold is all the other stuff that has to be taken out of the way to get the intake manifold off. The big scary one being, of course, the fuel rail has to be popped loose at least. There are ways to kind of muscle the fuel rail up and do this without taking it off. But if your fuel hoses, particularly these guys, right here, it's like an inch-long hose on each end. Actually, I think that one's longer. If those guys aren't brand new, I wouldn't be muscling this around. Also, not shown in this video, we did it right before the video, is start up the car and then pull fuse number 23, which is the fuel pump fuse, and if you need to open up the throttle while you're doing that, you run the engine until it runs out of gas. What you are doing there is depressurizing the fuel system. It's held at 2.5 or 3 or 3.5 bar, I don't remember which. Either way, it's got pressurized fuel in it. You don't want to be popping off these hoses when there's, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 psi of fuel, because you'll now get flammable liquid spraying everywhere in a fine mist, which isn't good. So now I'm going to pop loose the nuts holding this assembly. Here's the fuel rail. You can see the green top injectors. They're either 19 or 17 pound injectors. I can't remember. They're the standard M50 ones. But we have to disconnect the electrical connectors that are part of this housing. It's a pain in the butt, and we're probably going to skip through most of it after showing you the first one. But you pop that guy out of the way, and then we're going to undo one of those and just work the intake manifold up. Make sure you have Vaseline on hand to re-lubricate the O-rings before you press this guy back on. Alright, there is, the connector is very similar to, if I can pop this one off, this happens to be for the oil pressure light. This is very close to what the connector looks like. You can see there's this metal clip. We have to pop this metal clip off of all of these injectors because it's the button to get it off is not, it doesn't exist really. So yeah, this part is always fun. It's designed to not accidentally come off, which makes it very hard to get off purposefully. What you have to do, bring the camera over to this side, they'll never see it. You pop one side, one half of this little metal clip out. Come on. I don't quite have this in the right spot. You pop one out of the way, and then you pop the other out of the way, and it's very common for the first side to come back in when you pop the second side out, which is infuriating. Okay, so I have that one out, so that connector will come off once I get the rest of these guys out. Okay, so coming back after I just undid all of those clips, none of them came back on, pull this guy up, and then pretty much the first thing you do is re-engage all those clips so those little pieces of metal don't go flying under the engine somewhere. some of them are not quite coming back to their proper position already. That one's back. Now you can see a little better what I was doing. I was getting those two little metal tabs pushed out of the way. That one's not in the right spot. Now the fun fuel leaking part. So we're gonna pop off both of God, that hose is, I don't think that's a coolant hose. That's not a oil rated hose, which is why it's all puffed up. I don't know what that cap's on there for. So these two flexible hoses go underneath the intake to that one. I mean, the metal line starts almost immediately. The rubber one on the forward end comes to about here, and then they become metal lines again and go back down to the center under the manifold right here, where they become soft lines again for the transition from the engine to the body. You need a flexible line so the engine can move and all that good stuff. The problem is they really hug the underside of this manifold, so it's kind of clamping around both sides, which is why we need to separate it so we can kind of open up that shell and pull the manifold through. Otherwise you end up yanking on stuff that's old rubber and plastic parts that will probably break. So that's why I am a fan of pulling this stuff apart rather than muscling it. These are also not supposed to be screw types, at least on the later cars. They are one way turning. They're like safety style from the factory, so you can only tighten them. So you usually need a pair of pliers to actually loosen these guys. If you want to break them loose, you spray a little bit of penetrating fluid on it. You know, the V40 isn't amazing, but whatever. And then, this is not the right tool for this. What you're trying to do is rotate it to get that penetrating fluid to work its way in. I'm gonna pop these guys up, or at least try to. So there's nothing holding the injectors down right now other than their own stubbornness. So if you pull up on the fuel rail, you can pull them out. They just don't want to come out. All right. Do not want to cut. Is that enough wiggling? Probably not. Yeah, there's really stubborn old parts. I want to get that guy off.
Is that the safety nut you're talking about?
No, this one has a weird plastic cap on it. All right, here is the rail coming up. This is we'll see it better in a moment, but there is the vacuum line going into the pressure regulator, the fuel pressure regulator, and I am just twisting this hose, and you can see it's working its way off. There we go. That's off. Here is the fuel rail. Do not be too alarmed if one or two of those spindle caps stayed in the engine bay. When you, stayed in the engine. If they do fall into the intake, they're plastic. They won't hurt anything. You have to worry about metal falling in the intake. So when we put this back on, you're going to want to coat all of those guys in some Vaseline or any petroleum jelly to make sure they slide into the holes in the intake nicely. But here's your fuel rail. Now is a good chance to change the pressure regulator, change the filters and seals in these guys, all that good stuff. All right. So actually holding the intake manifold on is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts. They're 11 millimeter for reasons. There, and then there's the 2 underneath the intake. Those are the only actual bolts holding the intake onto the engine. I shouldn't say bolts. These are all nuts on studs coming out of the head. All the 7 bolts for the intake to head are undone. So now, from the factory, these guys come with these one-time use crimp connectors. We're going to cut off the one next to the intake. And in its place, we are going to be putting in a screw type crimp thing. I don't know. I'm blanking on the word. I can English, I promise.
Alligator clamp. Hose clamp.
Hose clamp thing. A screw type hose clamp. This is not a great pair of...
Tramp clamp.
Yes, sure. Alright. That's off. This, by the way, is to the brake booster, and this is the check valve. It can be fragile. So I guess be careful with it. Alright, that's out of the way. So, there is 1 bolt here, 1 bolt there for the braces that go down to the block. Again, we'll see them once this intake manifold is off. There is also this vacuum line is going to a connector on the underside of the intake somewhere around here. Because we took it off at the other end, we're fine. There's also the intake air temperature sensor somewhere under here. Once the intake comes off, it'll be easier to see where the heck it is. By the way, you could put serious weight on the intake manifold up until we get these bottom brace bolts off. Then it's a much more fragile situation. Alright, that guy is unclipped. Yeah, now all that's left is, also again, you will see it once the intake manifold is off, but you can actually see it entering into the intake. This doodad right here is from the idle air control valve. I'm trying to find where the clip is with my fingers. It almost feels like the little clip is gone. And there's not really anything holding it in. It freaking is.
Missing?
Yeah, I'm not crazy. But the part that weirds me out is it won't pop off.
Yeah, right.
Oh, is that RTV? Oh. That's why. But its own stubbornness. Yeah, I guess we'll figure that guy out once we get the bottom bracket bolts off. Wiggle it around until it cooperates. These guys are both 10 millimeter, and there's no getting around how annoying they are to access. Yes, I'm turning that the correct way. There we go. That's one broken. You're just a pain in the butt to get to. Up, and let me see if I can, because there's no freaking hose clamp on the other end of it, which is supposed to have a hose clamp. This is, oh wait, maybe?
Nope.
No, it's supposed to have a hose clamp.
No, I know, there isn't one, yeah.
But, so that clip is broken. It's supposed to go through there, so they just RTV'd this sucker in. This hose is...
not an oil hose.
Not an oil hose, which is why it's super swollen. Where's the screwdriver? Sure, that. So this guy comes off so that we can separate it from the intake. So, things that we couldn't see before. So there's the intake air temperature sensor, the plug for which is right there. Here is the fuel line. You can see it's a hard line here. It mounts to this brace that goes down to the engine. Also, it's got this holder that's supposed to hold this hose. This part is supposed to go up there. This guy gets supported right there. It's also supposed to clip in over there. This guy isn't, I mean, this hose has just been muscled into the wrong spot, sort of. This section is clipped in right there, which is why we kind of have to take off the fuel hose, because it's squeezing in on the intake from both sides. This is the idle air control valve. Its hose comes under here and pops out right there. The hose is a different part number and a slightly different shape if you have the traction control secondary throttle plate. This is, I like to call it the octopus hose, but it's going from up near the thermostat cover to the heater core, and then it has the big pipe coming off, goes all the way down over to here, and it can often get swollen from power steering leaks coming off of these things over here, and so you have to replace the whole hose because this little section over here fails. And then this little bit here comes off into the throttle plate and then cycles out of the throttle plate through the aux thermostat and back over through a myriad of hoses into the block. That's for the throttle plate heater. If you want to delete that, you just loop this guy to there. I've found that 99% of cars don't need it. It's to prevent icing on the throttle plate, but it needs to be really, really cold for that to happen. What else did I say we would see once we got under the intake? I think that's kind of it. This is to anybody that says that M50s have PCVs. Please demonstrate for me where in this straight hose that goes back into the intake there is a PCV. These cars do not have PCVs. Although real OEM says there's supposed to be something in there. I've never seen it. But here's your intake manifold. Whenever you take this off, I would recommend you change these 6 seals and the big guy over there. They are a required item if you're doing this on the V8s. The V8s love to leak these and then they don't hold idle right, but the straight 6s seem to be a little nicer on the seals. There is one removed intake manifold. Anything else to note while we're down here? The NOx sensors are, oh well, this is a non-Vanos. This doesn't have NOx sensors, but they would be. One would be right there and the other one would be somewhere over there. There's a bunch of things that I would service while I'm down here, but I mean, it's up to you. This can become a while we're in here job that gets big fast. But that's how to pull an intake. Installation is the reverse of removal.